Well, he more or less had to leave Boston. He was in a little bit of bother in Boston. He had fallen out with his brother, James Franklin, the printer, who was the editor of their newspaper, the New England Courant. And so Franklin needed to find a job, but there was simply no opening for a young printer in Boston, not least because James Franklin had gone about the place bad-mouthing him. So Franklin really had to leave. He'd also upset and antagonized some of his fellow residents of Boston with what were thought to be his heretical views about religion. So off he went. Now, first of all, he actually wanted to go to New York, but he couldn't find a job in New York. In New York, he met the Bradford family, who were the most important printers in New York at the time. And the father of the family, William Bradford, suggested that Franklin should go down to Philadelphia, where William's son Andrew had a printing firm. And so off Franklin set across southern New Jersey in the autumn of 1723, this kind of epic journey. And one of the things I do in my book is that I try to describe the way that Franklin, at a certain point, passed outside of the orbit of New England and entered the very different world that the Quakers were creating in Pennsylvania and in Maryland to the south. This is a very important moment in Franklin's life because suddenly his horizons begin to expand, and it was the first of a kind of series of events in his life, including his first stay in England in the mid-1720s, that went to make him the kind of extraordinarily innovative character that he became. What Franklin saw in Philadelphia when he first arrived was a town very different from Boston, where he'd grown up. Boston was much older. By this time, we're talking about 1723, Boston was already nearly 100 years old, and it had the appearance, actually in some ways, of an English town, with higgledy-piggledy houses and narrow, crooked lanes and so on. Philadelphia was very different. It had a grid pattern, for one thing. It had been laid out by William Penn, the great Quaker, in the 1680s, along what he thought was a kind of rational plan for a town. But it was also still actually very rural. The city was only really 3 or 4 blocks deep from the Delaware River. Beyond that, what you had was really open countryside. And people often commented about the woods and the fields stretching right up to the edge of the city, with the livestock and especially pigs rooting about among the orchards. People often commented about that. It was also a city, when Franklin first arrived, that was actually in a bit of economic difficulty. You wouldn't have thought it was going to one day become the first capital of what later became the United States, because there was a recession going on. Many lots were vacant, houses were empty, and so what Franklin saw was quite a raw, kind of uncrystallized city that was waiting to become the great metropolis that would one day emerge to become. Benjamin Franklin wasn't directly involved in the creation of Independence Hall, but nevertheless it's a building with which he had strong connections. You see, it was the brainchild of someone called Andrew Hamilton, who was a very important figure in Franklin's early life. Hamilton was probably the greatest trial lawyer in colonial America, and he was also a very important politician and power broker in Pennsylvania and in what later became the state of Delaware. And in the early 1730s, Hamilton wanted to see the creation of a new state house for Pennsylvania that would, if you like, stand as a kind of embodiment or of a symbol of the greatness that he foresaw for his colony. And so the building of Independence Hall began. It took about 20 years. There were lots of squabbles and arguments about the design, and there were problems when money ran out. But eventually it had emerged as this wonderful building. Even if the Declaration of Independence had never been declared in that building, it would still be a very fine example of 18th century architecture, a real kind of pinnacle of the achievements of Philadelphia in that period.
Click the subscribe button below and the bell icon to get notifications for new videos about George Washington and behind-the-scenes work at Mount Vernon.